welcomed some groups in, and we're very hopeful now that we are completely COVID secure, that we will be able to get through the winter and whatever else lies ahead. But it's a great pleasure to be with you again this evening, and an even greater pleasure to have as our guest General Sir Peter Wall. Peter retired from the British Army after a career spanning some 40 years. He joined the Royal Engineers from Sandhurst Military Academy in 1974 and read engineering at the University of Cambridge. He finished his military career as Chief of the General Staff from 2010 to 2014, and he has served all over the world, including operational command tours in Rhodesia, the Balkans, Iraq, and Afghanistan. And Peter is now a director of Amicus, an advisory business which specializes in imparting military and commercial leadership expertise with emphasis on strategic planning and execution, leadership development, and organizational health. And I think that aspect of Peter's life will be of great interest to our Society of Leadership Fellows. He is also a director of General Dynamics, the US Defense and Aerospace Corporation, and president of Combat Stress, the military veterans' mental health charity. Peter, I'm very grateful to you for making the time to be with us this evening. And we have an audience who I know are keen and eager to hear what you have to say. And I would say to you in the audience, if there are any questions you would like to put to Peter, please use the chat facility and I will try and field them through. Peter, I thought we would start, if I may, with Combat Stress. You're president of that organization, and I think it would be of real interest to our listeners to know what it does, why it is there, and how it does what it does.
Well, Gary, thank you very much for a warm welcome, and good evening to all your listeners. It's a great privilege to be on this call. Yes, I became president of Combat Stress, I think in 2015 or 2016, I can't quite recall. And I was motivated to do that because I could see that the lasting impact of a number of our operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, beyond physical injuries, which of course we knew about because people can't be discharged from the military unless their physical injuries have been sort of treated to the maximum extent, albeit people leave with prosthetic limbs and some in many cases quite significantly disabled still. The mental sort of ticking time bomb in some people's parlance is something that normally afflicts people something like 10 to 13 years after the event, and therefore that's inevitably for most people after they've left military service, and when in many cases they're extremely vulnerable. So Combat Stress, which was formed immediately after the First World War and had its centenary in 2019, which not a lot of people recognize, and it was a bold enterprise then when it started, because there was still a lot of people that thought that things like shell shock were a sort of cover for cowardice. But it was demonstrated that there was some tangible, clinically definable ailments that went under the banner of mental health problems. And Combat Stress, as it became known, and it's now our official title, was a charity that was set up to deal with the clinical and social aspects and implications of operationally driven mental health crises, which can be categorized in various levels, the most acute of which is called complex post-traumatic stress disorder, which I'm sure everyone's heard about, PTSD. And Combat Stress focuses, there are a number of players in the mental health sector, and there are certainly a number of players in the military veterans mental health sector, and Combat Stress has staked out its ground at the most acute end of that spectrum. And it has an annual budget of around 10 or 11 million pounds, which is not enough. It raises about half of that through its own fundraising. The rest comes from donations and contracts, donations from other service charities, for example, the Army Benevolent Fund, the other services benevolent funds, and indeed from some contracts with organizations like the NHS, Help for Heroes, and people like that.
Right.
And typically, a treatment pathway would involve either, historically this was more the case, a residential period of a few weeks in one of our installations or locations, of which we have 4 around the country. But much more recently, and catalyzed by the COVID experience, online consultations, which are of course much more convenient for individuals, much more cost effective. And I would say COVID has broken down the barriers because there was no alternative. And it's actually spurred on our ability to do more online consultations, which give us a greater ability to deal with a large number of people in any given time period. So that has actually been one of those unexpected benefits of COVID.
Yeah, indeed, as St George's House has found as well, that we've had to go online during closure, and there are things we've learned from that and will carry into the future. But is there a percentage of veterans who are affected by mental health issues? I mean, is there, what is the kind of the ratio?
That's a very good question. That's a very good question, because one of the questions we're always asked is, if you take soldiers who've been in a combat environment, how does the incidence of mental health illness or mental illness, mental poor health, compare with the national background average? And the answer to that question until 3 or 4 years ago was that it was less than. Now, in that smaller proportion, there were some much more complex and acute cases, but actually it was less than the national background number, despite combat experiences, which was quite a surprising and, you could say, encouraging number. And we did quite a lot of work in the military and in the charitable sector, aided and abetted by King's College London, who have a particular centre of excellence for this activity, under Professor Simon Wesley, who many will have heard of because he's a bit of a household name, to understand why that was. And there's a direct correlation between the quality of leadership in an organization and the likelihood that people will suffer from mental stress problems. And, that was very good, because we thought, well, here we're going on operations, and actually we're still below the national kind of threshold, if you like, or the national level. Actually, about 3 years ago, we crossed that boundary, and we now have a number of cases that are, we have more cases, more incidences, more reporting of people coming forward with their mental health challenges, and tending to do so more readily in a shorter time frame after they've been on operation. So when I was talking about 10 to 13 years being the average for the sort of 20th century cohort, for the 21st century cohort, i.e. the 9/11 wars, that number is lower. It's probably around, between 5 and 10. And that may itself not be a bad thing, because the Army has other services, but led by the Army and the Royal Marines, have put a lot of effort into reducing the stigma that is attached to mental health problems. And that's one of the reasons why it took so long for people to profess to their problems in the past. And that reduction of stigma has come through a program which is run called Trauma Risk Management, where the moment soldiers join the Army or the Royal Marines, they're exposed to the potential risks of mental implications of operations. They're reminded of that when they embark on a particular deployment to Iraq or Afghanistan, wherever it may be. They're monitored throughout, and they're particularly checked on the way back. And so that has made it much easier for people to put their hand up and say, look, I'm suffering from this, I need some help. So that probably means we are capturing a higher proportion of the population at risk, which I think is a very good thing. But there are still, as you will have read in the media, some tragic cases of people who've had stark experiences in places in Afghanistan. We could almost predict where they're going to be, because we know the places and the regiments and the times where the most intense activities happened. So, for example, places like Sangin district in Helmand. There are still people who fall between the cracks and commit suicide because of their traumatic experiences, which of course is tragic and is a pretty sad indictment of our systems nationally, of which the combat stress is but one tool in the box, if you like.
Yeah. And do you find that mental health issues reach across ranks?
Yeah, I think that they do reach across ranks, but people's ability to handle the implications are very much related to their personal family situation, the sort of support they have. And I think it's fair to say, without generalizing too much, that the officer class experiences it and manages it and suffers it, and others who are less lucky in terms of the family arrangement in which they live. This is a very distinct generalization. I don't want to be misinterpreted. It's not binary like this. There are certain people who end up on the streets who are more likely to suffer, and very often they don't come forward and say, I've got a mental health problem. They're only swept up by the system when they're homeless, their family have rejected them, they're heavily into alcohol and solvents, their whole life has fallen apart, and they get swept up, and actually the root cause of all of that is a mental health problem.
Right, and you mentioned earlier the 4 locations that you have where veterans are treated. So are they treated separately from civilians and with mental health
Well,
issues?
the ones I mentioned are the combat stress locations.
Yeah.
We have a headquarters with a big sort of facility near Leatherhead. We have a location up in Shropshire. We have one in Edinburgh, and then another place in the Midlands. But everybody is also can go through the national health system.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's fair to say that particularly at the complex end of PTSD, the national health system for mental health, military or civilian, is not as good as it is for other sort of clinical morbidities, as it were.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's quite backward. It's quite interesting how, when COVID struck, the NHS came to the military to understand how to handle the mental health challenges of their teams in hospitals, particularly in the intensive care world.
Right, interesting. And have you found with COVID that there's been a difficulty with funding? Is it now harder to raise funds in the current crisis?
Well, we feared that it would be, but first of all, this tendency for people to be more accepting of remote virtual treatment online, rather like this conversation, meant we could be more cost effective. And secondly, various policy shifts in the NHS, which may or may not have been related to my earlier commentary about, crikey, these people know about this stuff, perhaps we need to befriend them rather than hold them at arm's length. Don't quote me on any of this. Meant that actually the NHS came to us, and we now, and so too did the British Legion, who were very supportive of the of trying to fill this potential gap. And so as a consequence of that, we're in slightly better shape rather than worse shape.
Right, and interesting. And one of our
that's also, Gary, we should mention, and there may be some listeners on here who are part of this equation, that the generosity of the public sitting at home did not diminish just because of COVID and the remoteness of everything. We did very well from individual donors, for which we're hugely grateful, and they can be assured that what they're donating is making a really big impact on people's lives.
Very good. And one of our listeners asks, you've mentioned the 4 locations in England, but is there similar activity in Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland?
So we do have a facility in Northern Ireland. Wales is served by the place I mentioned is Shrewsbury, which is not ideal. The place in Edinburgh looks at Scotland, and then we are involved in the Midlands, that sort of caters for that area. And obviously Towett House does the south. The Royal Marines have a facility in the southwest. And it's not ideal that people have to travel that far for a residential treatment session. And that's why this online solution, which means people can have treatment in security of their own homes, surrounded by their own families, is actually a bit of a revelation. I mean, you would think it's a bit obvious, wouldn't you? But there was always a tendency in the past to say, if you've got this sort of problem, you've got to go into a home where it deals with it, and when you've recovered, you can come out. Which, of course, that the stigma of all of that was it's stressful enough in itself.
Yeah. And when you spoke earlier about some of the veterans who, because of circumstances, family circumstances, etc., they end up homeless, on the streets, there's solvent abuse, there's alcohol abuse. It just makes me think of that broader question of the transition from army life to civilian life generally. And do you think that the UK gets that right?
It's a really, really good question. I bumped into an excellent fellow who won't mind me mentioning his name, Hugh Milroy, a former Royal Air Force officer who runs a thing called Veterans Aid. I bumped into him yesterday at Victoria Station when I was on my way off on a journey. And he is in one of these organizations that sweeps people up in their moment of need, almost in their minute of need, and puts a roof over their head, gets them fed, and tries to find some sort of pathway to betterment. And they're quite well supported. They operate in the center of the city. And he's absolutely on the front line of this. And we were talking about what type of people fall into that situation, whether it's a mental health issue or just, falling the wrong way in a sense. And, we have to accept that a lot of people join the army from pretty underprivileged backgrounds. The army gives them a home, it gives them a purpose, it feeds them.
Oh, you've just frozen on us, but I hope the signal will pick up again in a second. And if you just unmute again, we'll be good.
Yeah, I just popped off there briefly. I'm back now.
Don't worry.
I hope I'm back for everybody else. And actually, many people have a complete transformation of their prospects, and they're given training, and they can get a trade and whatever. And they serve in the army for anything from, say, 4 to 20 to 30 years. And they then leave, and they're back at another crossroads. Am I able to use my military experience and all of the support I've built around myself and my network and my friends to actually have a soft landing when I go outside the military? And of course, in the very, very high proportion of cases, that is true. But in other cases, whether it's through various forms of addiction like alcohol or other health problems, or the inability to secure a stable job, 1 or 2, a tiny percentage, but they're a very visible percentage, fall by the wayside, and they do need to be picked up. So I think that we're very, very good at setting the conditions for people to be self-reliant. We're perhaps not quite so good at picking up the tiny percentage that falls between the cracks.
Yeah. Okay.
And this is in part because it's not the MOD or the Army's responsibility for people when they've retired. We don't run like the Americans. We don't run an incredibly well-funded veterans safety net. We have a sort of policy house for this.
Yeah.
We have a minister for veterans in the MOD, but he or she doesn't have vast amounts of resources or intelligence or whatever. They're very much a sort of policy branch. And so I think it's very good that the proportion is, in my estimation, pretty small. It's not so good that the ones who fall the wrong side of the line
well, that's
rely
interesting.
on charity to pick them up.
Yeah, because interestingly, there's a question from one of our listeners about how does our experience of dealing with these issues in the UK compare, for example, with Europe or other parts of the world?
Well, I don't have any numbers on Europe. I think we can compare ourselves with our American compadres, who have a vast veterans organization, which costs the US Department of Defense huge sums of money. And that's actually created a dependency culture that isn't necessarily something we'd want to replicate. So that sort of approach also has its risks. So, and, you know, in the case of UK, that would seriously affect our defense budget if we went down that track, unless someone was prepared to ante up new money for it. Now, we mustn't overlook the fact that we have this armed forces covenant, which was embarked on in the Gordon Brown era in about 2009. And an awful lot of institutions of all sorts, not just in the charitable or welfare or social security space, have signed up to this, which is essentially to make sure that service people and their families are not disadvantaged by the fact of being in the military. So when you come out of the military, for example, and you might have a perfectly cohesive nuclear family, you know, you can find housing, you can get a little bit of a push onto a doctor's or a dentist's waiting list, all that sort of stuff. You can access education for your children. You're not sort of at the end of a long queue behind, you know, all the asylum seekers and everybody else. So that's actually a great privilege for the military, and I think that project has been a success. It's probably got some way to go, but you know, that is our response to this: is to appeal to the nation to be more receptive to military people, rather than to go down the American route of setting up a huge infrastructure.
Yeah, thank you. And you mentioned there a moment ago the defence budget. So I thought I would just open things out a little bit and ask you something about that, because of course you were involved very closely when the reform of the army was about to be undertaken, and with the threat of Dominic Cummings coming in to sort everything out. What do you think of progress in that field at the moment?
Well, so I went through a defence review in 2010, 2011, which caused the army to be reduced by 20% in terms of its budget and its manpower. And we had to redesign the army. We called it then Army 2020, because we thought it was going to take, you know, 7 or 8 years to get it sorted, which I think is a pretty good guess. And there was then another defence review in 2015, which wasn't particularly conclusive. And then what they call the integrated review that's happened in 2020 and was driven through very hard despite COVID, which I actually think was a good thing, was a much more significant reappraisal of the post-Blair wars, if you like, Iraq and Afghanistan situation, with this very, very clever sort of geostrategic paper explaining what the ambition was going to be, which had, so as I recall, it had 4 things in it. It basically had the continued defense of the UK through NATO, effectively. It had this pivot to Asia. It had much more emphasis on wider strategic risks, such as pandemics, slightly closing the door after the horse was bolted. And it had something about us maintaining our security and strategic primacy through the pursuit of technology. 4 very credible strands that I think made a lot of sense, and I thought it was a very good bit of work. Then, of course, follows the defense paper, which talks not only about the way that defense is going to play into that space, because the integrated review in its geostrategic sort of paper, its policy paper, was not just about defense, it was about the intelligence services, the aid budget, all these things. But the MOD bit of that was in the integrated review white paper, which of course had a budget attached to it. And that budget actually involved quite a significant uplift in defence expenditure, despite the fact that the country was pouring lots of money into the COVID hole through the furlough scheme and business schemes and whatever. So everybody was very, very impressed with that. But it was quite difficult to square the circle, because we then saw more money, but very significant cuts to the Army and the Air Force and bits of the Navy. And a sort of jam tomorrow thing, like, well, we're going to take a lull in capability through the middle of the next decade, and all our new systems, our sunrise systems, as they were called, the new ones, would come into effect in the latter part of the decade, with a following wind. And so we're going to be slightly off games for a bit, and then we're going to be back on it big time in, let's say, call it 7, 8, 9 years time, which could easily be 10, 11, 12, the way defense acquisition goes, as we know. So I never really saw the math to the point where I could understand why this massive budget increase required short-term cuts. And very often the policy clarity is slightly clouded by the financial alchemy of a defense budget. And we'll have to see what happens, because, back in, let's say, Philip Hammond's time as the Secretary of State for Defence, for whom I worked when I was in the Army, his great claim was he had eradicated the £38 billion backlog in expenditure for equipment that was building up in that time. The chances are that that will recreate itself quite quickly. And we have to accept that we have to get more efficient at generating the capability for UK defence than we have been in the past. We as a nation are not very good at getting bang for our buck compared, for example, with the French and the Americans. And that's just a structural flaw in the way we do stuff and our relationship with industry, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So very challenging time for my successors who are in the hot seats at the moment. And we'll have to see which way it goes. Right. I mean, the Navy fared very well in that review. The Air Force took a bit of a kicking, and the Army took, another kicking. Right. In my opinion.
Yeah. And
I hope there's no journalists. No journalists recording all this, are there?
No, there aren't. And when you mentioned Philip Hammond there, I'm interested in that relationship between senior military figures and the politicians. I mean, that must be quite a delicate dance.
Mm-hmm. Delicate is one way of putting it. So I think that one of the interesting things about the military is, if you're in it for a long, long time, you absolutely absorb the military culture, which is built around trust. I would like to think, not always, but mostly about transparency, people putting their hands up when things aren't going very well. A very, very strong impetus on looking after our people and giving the best chance and the fairest chance for them to progress themselves in their career paths, all these sorts of things. And, an organization that has a culture and a set of values that any business or charity or public sector organization would aspire to replicate. And to a greater lesser extent, with a couple of rough edges, the Army does that okay. I'm talking the Army. You could translate this into the Royal Marines or the Air Force or the Navy. Obviously, things go wrong. There's the odd bad apple, there's the odd faff, there's the odd horror. But for the most part, you've got 100,000 people. There's going to be one or two people who are doing what you don't want them to do, aren't there? Well, we're 100,000 when I started. When I left, there were about 80,000. But it's still a big number. It'll fill Twickenham, just about. And so you then work with your politicians, who come from a slightly different stable, and of necessity behave in a very, very different way, because the political environment is such a difficult and unforgiving space, particularly so nowadays with social media, with 24-hour media on the conventional media's 24-hour thing, and it's a very, very unforgiving space, as we have been seeing recently. Pre-reshuffle, and it'll start again after the reshuffle that's just happened. And so I was very lucky to work for Philip Hammond. He was an experienced minister, having been in the transport department. He's an incredibly bright guy. He puts in a big shift every day, works very hard. Hope you're listening, Philip. Didn't naturally understand the military way. He come from a commercial background, thought we were all a bit strange. His natural assumption was that we were out to kind of drop him in it, which of course wasn't the case. I mean, you know, in the Ministry of Defence, there are sort of three cohorts of people who have to work together. The civil service plays a very strong and sort of long-term role. The single services are there all the time. And then you have your political leadership, of which there's 6 or 7 ministers in the OAD. And he was the Secretary of State for Defence for 3.5 years. I worked, you know, for my 4-year term as the head of the army, it was Philip to whom I reported. And, you know, actually, he was very, very supportive. I mean, okay, he extracted his pound of flesh, but he also gave us a lot of support as well and help. So he then went on to be Chancellor and Foreign Secretary, and then got a bit of he just got kicked out without a by your leave or thank you, which tells you, he went to the House of Lords, which tells you how ruthless politics is, because there's someone who committed, what, 7, 8, 9 years of their life, working a 7-day week, probably 18 hours a day, you know, rain or shine. And that's what politics is like. And it's not helpful to us as a nation, in my opinion, that politicians have such a rough ride, because it's a major disincentive to talented people whom we need to run a complex country like ours and make it flourish in the post-Brexit, post-COVID, post-whatever world. Yeah. So we're not helping ourselves by the media making political life so difficult, and, you know, the natural assumption is that every politician's on the make and they're only out for themselves, because most of them are putting in a massive shift of service on behalf of the nation.
Yeah, but just staying with politics for a moment, and a question from another listener. What impact has Brexit had, or do you think will it have, on the armed forces and the UK's ability to defend or promote its interests through the military?
Well, it's very, very interesting you should ask that, because pre-Brexit, I had just retired, and I knew a load of folks in Number 10, and they got on to me. This is David Cameron's Number 10, obviously. They got on to me and said, David Cameron would like you to lead the military kind of, you know, one of these letters with lots of generals and admirals and air marshals, and the military statement about how important it is that we stay in the EU for UK's defence. And I said to this fellow who I'd known for quite some time, I said, who was an intern in a senior policy guy in Number 10, I said, well, I disagree with you on 2 counts. First of all, a whole load of us, like a load of nodding poodles, saying that just makes us all look stupid, and it makes David look desperate. And secondly, I don't believe in the proposition, because basically we do our defence not through the Europe, but through NATO. And NATO has its challenges, but it's nothing to do with Brexit. Now, that was a slight simplification, because there are areas where we depend on, you know, Interpol and things like that, and European cooperation to deal with organised crime and things like that. But, you know, our intelligence and military relationships are much more through Five Eyes, NATO, blah, blah, blah. And so I said, no, we're not doing that. And we didn't do it. It was great. And I actually thought, you know, for the military, Brexit was going to be more or less neutral. So when it happened, I was pretty surprised. But I thought, you know, well, it's the people have spoken. If you have democracy and you ask people what they think and give you the answer, that's the answer you've got to get on with. So I'm never into all this nonsense about let's, you know, that was a false readout, let's do it again, or let's try and, you know, let's try and sort of disrupt the inaction of Brexit. And I think that inevitably it has created at the political level, exacerbated by what's gone on in COVID with the success of our vaccination program against what happened in Europe and all that kind of stuff, which I think was very lucky for us that it worked out that way, a bit unlucky for Europe, but it created more frictions and whatever. I think it's created a bit of a standoff at the political level, just at a time when we need to be cooperating more closely. And I think the military can provide a bit of a short circuit and a lightning conductor for that situation, because we're not political. We've got strong relationships with particularly our French, German, and Italian counterparts. I would say you'd expect the Americans to provide their umbrella and their wraparound that encourage us all to pull together, but they've just demonstrated they're going off piste in another direction under Biden post the Afghan debacle, which is utterly shameful. You might want to talk about that in a minute. And so it's down to us to make sure we don't really want to be part of a European army, and we never did when we were in Europe. But we do want to be part of a coalition of people who are prepared to step up to the plate against Russian mendacity in Eastern Europe, which we've got, against the Poles, against the Balts and the Baltic states and so on. And, to play its part in the global opposition as part of the Western position against countries like Iran, China, whoever it might be, who's causing us problems. But we've seen how things like migrant flows, which are in part a security issue, have been met with really a pretty weak response in terms of the cohesion of the European attitude. I mean, basically, Europe under COVID and migrant flows has demonstrated that nationalism is alive and well, because people distance themselves from a centralized, coordinated European policy and stake out their own ground, because their politicians are under pressure to deliver for their people. So I think that's a long-winded answer, but I think that we need to keep working at trying to sort of coordinate, converge, and make sure we've got enough nations in Europe who are prepared to call out bad behavior and step up to the plate and do something about it. I'm not, on the strength of what we've seen in the last few years, hugely optimistic about that, but that's what we should be striving for.
Right, and so you can't see the emergence of a European army, for example?
Well, there might be one, but I mean, that will manifest itself it won't manifest itself in terms of more raw military capability. It'll have more headquarters, more sort of chest thumping, and it'll be a political enterprise. So the danger is that actually what it does, it sucks money out of frontline capability in order to provide this political facade. And we've got enough political facade in NATO.
Okay, and let's come back just finally, as we come towards the end of our time, to Afghanistan, as you mentioned. We've seen the Taliban take power, now running Afghanistan in government in Kabul, after 20 years when the might of the West, the Americans, the British, and others were there. That evacuation, how do you feel about that?
Well, I feel that I was part of something that has turned about to be an utterly false prospectus. So when I was a brigadier in just after 9/11, I was part of a team that went into Kabul in December 2001 to support the formation of the Karzai government, which was effectively the Northern Alliance, the non-Taliban government in terms of its tribal makeup, after the Taliban had been seriously banished. They were shattered. And funny enough, I was in an organization called the Joint Force Headquarters, and the people who came out with us were called 16 Air Assault Brigade. And the battalion that came with 16 Air Assault Brigade was called the 2nd Battalion, the Parachute Regiment. Very famous for their stand on the bridge at Arnhem, what they did at Goose Green, all these things. So just file that away. And so we embarked on this enterprise, which was initially about banishing Al-Qaeda from Afghanistan and negating any safe havens for terrorist organizations, notwithstanding the best efforts of the Pakistani intelligence services, ISI, can't remember what it stands for, can't remember it, Inter-Services Intelligence Organization, to actually keep promoting instability through the Pashtu belt, which is the south eastern side of Afghanistan, down the Durand line, which is the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan. And we were quite successful at doing that, but we got distracted by the invasion of Iraq in 2003, and we took a pause, and Afghanistan became what the military calls an economy of effort operation. And during that time, the aided and abetted by the Pakistanis, the Taliban had time to recoup and regroup and recreate itself and reimpose its medieval fatwa, if you like, on all of the rural areas of south and eastern Afghanistan. And then 2006, we kind of wake up to what's going on, and we then engage in this incredibly expensive and costly, in terms of not only our lives, but Afghan lives, Afghan military lives, operation to build a 350,000 strong Afghan security force, sort of cast in a Western image, an American image, with quite sophisticated equipment that was going to hold the line and increasingly give Afghanistan autonomy over itself. And that didn't work as well as it should, because actually the effective fighting strength of the Afghan security force is probably below 100,000, because people were siphoning off wages. People were very skeptical about whether they're going to provide the medical and fire support as the NATO presence closed down. But even against, in that situation, as it was, say, post 2016, 17, 18, after we'd really reduced our forces very significantly, we must remember David Cameron in 2011 said we're going to be out in 2014. He's the first person who pulled a brick out of the wall on this, but let's park that for now. And I'm not saying it was the wrong thing to do, but that's what happened. And so you ended up with a situation where a very small American and Western force was providing moral support and some fire support and other technical support and intelligence support for the Afghan army and the Afghan government. And whilst the Taliban had a lot of freedom in the rural areas, which we'd left, so lots of places like Helmand, where we lost a lot of lives and limbs, were back in under sort of tacit Taliban control. The key cities were very firmly under Afghan government control, and that level of force would probably have allowed that situation to continue for quite a long period. And that would have been the right thing to do, because it would have kept Afghanistan's problems inside Afghanistan's borders. And we would still be able to say there's no Al Qaeda or IS type organizations likely to go mount another like Twin Towers type spectacular in the Western world. But Biden decided, because I don't think he cares, that he wasn't going to do that. And he made the cardinal mistake of pulling out during the fighting season. So if he'd done it 3 months' time, when all the Taliban are actually doing something else, which is mainly, they're harvesting poppy, or they're back doing other things, it probably wouldn't have been such an acute collapse. But in the height of the fighting season, the Taliban's strengths are at their highest, and they romped home. And a lot of it was psychological. They basically said to people in the Afghan military, right, mate, you've got two choices. You either lay down your weapons, you're going to kill your family, take your pick. Well, that's not a difficult choice when you're going to be on the losing side. So, what's always happened in Afghan conflicts is people change sides very quickly when they can see which way the dice are rolling and the wind is blowing. And so we end up with that horrendous debacle in Kabul, around the international airport, when the extraction was happening. And guess what 3 organizations from UK were leading the UK extraction? The Joint Force Headquarters, 16 Air Assault Brigade, and the 2nd Battalion Parachute Regiment. That's just a little bit of a bookend, which, these things are ironic, aren't they?
Yeah.
And so I think it's utterly shameful. I think it's completely unnecessary. I don't think it signals the demise of American strategic might. That'll blow over. They're still an incredibly wealthy, innovative country who can do whatever they want, frankly. It's just they've lost their will under Biden. Yeah. I think that we were supplicants in part to that, because we allowed the Americans to do that without any consultation. And part of that, I think, is linked to Brexit and Boris's concerns over Biden and Northern Ireland. And, they had a G7 summit in Cornwall. Why weren't they talking about this? Because, there were a few other issues that were a distraction. And I don't think the UK cares much about this, not nearly enough. And it will bite us in the arse at some point. And I hope that we do have a proper inquiry to learn our lessons, because this is as big. We had a massive inquiry about Iraq, which is mostly politically driven. This is a bigger grand strategic defeat, which is probably, I was born in 1955, around just before Suez. This competes with Suez as a grand strategic defeat for Western military.
And does it, I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head there when you said America will survive this because it is such a colossal power. But what damage has it done to the UK? I mean, is Britain still a global force militarily, or is that irreparably damaged?
I don't, everyone says we're no longer a global power. Well, when were we last a global power? Quite a long time ago. We're still quite a force to be reckoned with, because when you combine our military capability with the way that other parts of the world are sympathetic to our values, our soft power capability in terms of education, things like the World Service, the British Council, and the fact that we still have quite strong footholds in all those places that were pink on the atlas when I was studying geography age 5 at school or whatever. Those things haven't gone away. Some of those places still have, rather strangely, a hell of a sympathy and empathy for the way UK conducts itself. They're slightly shocked by some of the things we get up to nowadays, particularly, the lack of integrity in our parliamentary processes and all that sort of stuff. But for the most part, they would rather work with British commerce, British cultural organizations. We've got a lot of wasta in those sorts of spaces. We want to use it. So, if you've got a combination between diplomatic capability, commercial capability, your intelligence and military capabilities, and your general will to want to promote your values and support countries in the world that are under threat from autocracies, then there's going to be a market for you. But we will be doing it primarily in concert with and collaboratively with a whole load of alliances and allegiances. It's very interesting to read today that UK, US are going to support Australia in generating a nuclear submarine capability, i.e. nuclear hunter-killer type submarines rather than bomber submarines with nuclear missiles on. And that's only going to happen, but with two companies, with British Aerospace Systems and the company I happen to be associated with, General Dynamics, who are the prime contractor for all of the United States Navy's nuclear submarines through a company called Electric Boat. And, that's a very, very interesting alliance, isn't it? And that's playing to our allegiance with Australia as our kith and kin. And it's in the sense of a common view of the threat posed by China in the Pacific. So there's plenty of scope for more of this stuff.
And I was, in fact, just about to ask you about the AUKUS, as it is now called, hot off the press today, but you got there before me. You beat me to it. Peter, that has really been terrifically interesting. And I think one of the things about these conversations is that they allow us in some way to get behind the scenes. And I think you've done that admirably for us tonight. So I want to thank you very much. I'd also like to thank our audience. Thank you for tuning in, for listening. Thank you for all your questions. I didn't get through them all, but I hope I got through a good number of them. And I hope that we will see you all again at St. George's House in conversation before long.